Shalom Aleichem. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to everybody. Peace and blessings. This is Universal God Message of Peace, and I'm Lee Weissman, and this is Dr. Zaheer, and we are here, and that's Lale Tuncher, and we're here in Abrahamic dialogue to talk about the meaning and function of law in religion. And last week, I spoke at some length about the role of law in Judaism. And this week, my colleague is going to talk about the role of law in Islam. And I get to ask the questions.
Right. Thank you very much, Rabbi Wiseman. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin in the name of the God whose mercy is profound, whose kindness is forever. The first thing that I would want to mention about the law is that the Quran describes it as shira or sharia, which itself clarifies is minhaj, which, as mentioned by Rabbi Wiseman in his presentation last week, that it means a way of living. So that's what the understanding is, that our Creator has given us a law, and the law needs to be followed. And the idea is that we live our lives according to a certain way that He expects from us to follow. I did mention in one of my earlier discussions that was to do with worship, that the Quran, or was it about the ethics and morality, that the Quran uses two words for the expectations of the Almighty from His servants. One is Al-Kitab, and the other is Al-Hikmah. And these two expressions, they talk about two different important components of what we might call the law. The one part or component is what all humans already know, which is what Al-Hikmah is, the moral, ethical principles which are ingrained in human nature, and they were given to humans as a part of the design of their personalities. The Book of God just reminds us about them and informs us about their importance, significance, tells us that the Almighty expects us to follow all moral principles, and assures us that we're all going to be held accountable on the basis of those principles. The other part of the expectations is Al-Kitab, which is sometimes, to distinguish it from moral principle, is described as the law. And the law, Al-Kitab, is again based on moral principles. The only difference is that when it comes to the question of the law, the Sharia, it is actually a clarification, a verdict of the Almighty in matters where humans are not very clear. Humans actually need clear guidance, verdict from the Almighty. So we needed the law, we needed Sharia. We already have, the kind of understanding, clarity that is needed by all human beings to live their lives properly according to the expectations of the Almighty. But still, there's always a room for discussion and debate, and there are always confusions where clear understanding is needed, and that is what the law provides. I did give an example in one of my earlier presentations regarding the moral principles that are expected to be followed in business matters, uh, and we don't need any divine verdict or guidance regarding them. All that we need is reminder. But in regard to the prohibition of interest, because there was a confusion, there was a debate that was clarified. I might give another example, which I should have said right at the beginning. It's as a disclaimer that all that I'm saying is my own understanding of what the Islamic law is and its various different aspects that need to be clarified. So, the Quran tells us that all pure food, all different uh, possibilities that are there for humans to consume food, are all halal, are all uh, allowed to us. And all impure food is what is prohibited, what should not be consumed. Uh, and one of the implications of this understanding was that uh, when it comes to animals, when it comes to the flesh, meat of animals, uh, all animals that are by design, their nature, they are vegetarians. They are allowed, if their meat is allowed to be consumed, and all beasts that consume, that live on the flesh of others, other animals, they are prohibited. Uh, Now, it's pretty much clear. It's something which normally humans do not violate. I mean, um, we don't find many nations. There could be exceptions, and obviously, when there are exceptions, there are reasons why those exceptions are there. But you don't find even societies which do not follow any religious law consuming the flesh of dogs or cats or lions or tigers, etc. Uh, but there was always a confusion regarding the flesh of swine, pig, uh, you know, because by its nature, it so happens that uh, pigs are like goats, sheep, as far as their category is concerned. Um, Even now, societies which do not follow any religious law, particularly those who are not neither Jews nor Muslims, they don't make any distinction. And therefore, there was this clear verdict from the Almighty that was needed that, like all other beasts, uh, pig consumes the flesh of animals as well. So, don't be mistaken. Don't be confused by the fact that they seem to be apparently belonging to the same category as other animals that are used for purpose of farming, etc., and are they belong to the category of cattle. So what I'm trying to say is that the Sharia, which is Al Kitab, the law, it has its own area, jurisdiction within which it operates and gives the Almighty's verdicts. And there are many other examples. I didn't mention in my earlier one of my earlier presentations that the purpose of the law is ultimate purpose is purification, which in turn is, according to the Quran, uh, the only uh, criterion which will be uh, used for the purpose of deciding uh, the ultimate fate of individuals, whether they would be eligible for the paradise or not. So there is a minimum expectation of tazkiyah, of purification that is needed. And the entire law and the entire all teachings of the Almighty, they seek to attain the purpose of purification. And when we purify ourselves, we are also thereby enabling us to be morally and ethically uh, getting stronger, better, and achieving higher levels of excellence. Um, so that's what the purpose of the Islamic Sharia is. So what we find is that the law is emphasizing the purification of our bodies, the purification of the food that we consume, and most importantly, the purification of our moral behavior. Now, where do we get this law from? Uh, in the description of the sources of Islamic law, the first source that's talked about by all is the Quran, which we Muslims believe is God's word from A to Z, fully preserved. And this book of the Almighty is described as Al-Furqan. Now, the meaning of Al-Furqan is the source that distinguishes between right and wrong. Interestingly, the same expression has been used for Torah as well, that it was sent by the Almighty, and the idea was that it should serve as Al-Furqan. It should clarify to all believers what is right from what is wrong and should clearly distinguish. Uh, there was a discussion, I remember, when we were talking about the diversity of opinions that is possible within law. Um, I do agree that, when you understand law, and I'll talk a little more about it later, uh, there is diversity that you find taking place, find people going for. But let me express my understanding, which is slightly different from some others. Uh, that diversity is not the purpose. Honestly, I believe that it is not something that should be the target or objective or should be celebrated. Indeed, diversity should be accepted. It should be acknowledged. And the reason is that when we are not prophets, we have not been given direct communication with the Almighty, and we're just trying to understand the Almighty's law. We are humans, so we are likely to commit mistakes. And nobody is allowed to make a firm, confident claim that he or she has understood the law absolutely correctly. But that doesn't really mean that we should believe that the law itself can be understood differently. Now, there's only one understanding that the Almighty has given us. However, which one of these several understandings that are claimed to be correct, which one is the right one? Well, nobody can make a final confident claim. All that we can do is to come up with our arguments and let people decide. So the Quran is the first and the most significant source. Along with the Quran is the other source of Sunnah, which are the religious practices of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. These practices, like the Quran, were given to the first generation of Muslims, the companions of the Prophet, in a way that all of them knew what Sunnah religious practices were. Quite often, Muslims use the same expression, Sunnah, for whatever they come to learn about the Prophet that he did. That, I believe, is an incorrect use of the expression. Because, I mean, if the Prophet, for example, used camels to travel, many people might say that it's a sunnah, but that was his practice because those were the means of transportation, these animals that were available. So sunnah talks about, or sunnah is dealing with a particular set of um, practices that the Prophet followed and declared them as the religious practices. And what we find in the Quran is a mention in one of the chapters, in chapter number 16, that these practices were adopted by the Prophet following the command of the Almighty, which required him to follow the religion of Abraham. So it was Abraham's religious practices that the Prophet followed, and he followed in a way that all his companions, they followed him, emulated him likewise, and thus we have Sunnah. Just to give you an example, uh, while the Quran does talk about Salat, formal prayers, very often, but does not give clearly an idea of how those prayers are to be performed. A book cannot give you an idea of how a certain practice of religious ritual is to be performed. You have to have somebody who does it, and then his example is emulated. So while the Quran talks about the formal prayer as salat, it is the sunnah, the religious practice of the Prophet, that gives us the idea, the understanding of what a salat is and what the Almighty's expectations are. So the sunnah is the other source. And as far as the reliability, authenticity of these two sources are concerned, well, both are equally reliable because both satisfy the two important criteria of authenticity. One is unanimity. All first generation Muslims were in agreement of what constituted the Quran from A to Z, and they also agreed upon what were the religious practices that they learned from the Prophet as a part of the expectation for them to follow God's religion. There is a third source, which is called hadith, which is quite often the subject of discussion, debate, and disagreement amongst Muslims. It's the word of the Prophet or his actions which were reported by individuals. Not everybody reported it. In fact, there were a few people who reported a certain statement or a certain practice of the Prophet to some people belonging to the next generation. And they, in turn, they reported the same statement or practice to the next generation. And at some point in the Muslim academic scholarly history, there were people who put them down and compiled in an organized way these statements and practices, describing those practices as the books of hadith. They are described as books of hadith. There are a number of them. 6 of them are more famous. 2 of them being the most reliable. The book of hadith compiled by Bukhari and the book of hadith compiled by Muslim. Both these scholars belong to the 3rd century Hijrah, that is more than 200 years after the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, left this world. These books talk about almost everything that those who narrated them heard, saw, or experienced. So it's always a discussion and debate as to which hadith is reliable, which is not, how is it relevant, related to the Quran and Sunnah. And there are always debates regarding the question whether hadith is an independent source or not. I, for one, tend to agree with those scholars who say that hadith is uh, a footnote of the Quran and Sunnah. It is not an independent source of learning of Islam. It just clarifies, explains what is already there in the Quran and Sunnah. And one important reason why I believe that this point of view is correct is that while we find that the Quran and Sunnah were given by the Prophet to the first generation Muslims in a very responsible way, so that all of them had this source of learning. Hadith uh, was not a source that primarily was arranged by the Prophet to be meticulously shared with all his companions. And because that was not done by him, uh, what it means is that his companions did not know all the information that is now contained in the books of hadith. So it's an important source, but it's not an original uh, primary source of learning of Islam. It is only an explanatory notes of the Quran and Sunnah, and therefore they have to be understood in the light of the Quran and Sunnah. Now, quite apart from these sources, there are other sources that are also claimed: ijtihad, qiyas, ijma. I mean, ijtihad and qiyas really are the same. Uh, it's an attempt made by scholars to understand the later developments in human experiences in the light of the Quran and Sunnah and Hadith. So these are actually opinions of scholars based on their scholarly uh, research and their debates. Uh, and therefore, it's quite understandable that when scholars do ijtihad, they disagree with each other as well. Uh, there's also a claim amongst many Muslims, scholars and ordinary Muslims, uh, that there is another source called ijma, which is the unanimity, complete agreement of the scholars on a certain matter. Uh, I tend to agree with the opinion which says that the claim that there is ijma on any matter that has to do with religious opinions is a wrong claim. It's not possible. So while the Quran and Sunnah were delivered to the Muslims through ijma, that is a complete agreement amongst the companions, there is nothing apart from the Quran and Sunnah about which you can claim that there is an ijma. Because for one thing, you don't even know how many scholars are there in any particular era. And aside from the last 50 or less years, it wasn't possible for scholars to come together and talk about something so that they're able to come to a unanimous understanding. So it really is only a claim, which at best what you can say is that if we find that there are a large number of scholars agreeing on a certain point, well, it's an important claim, but nothing other than that. Uh, Fiqh is religious jurisprudence, understanding of the scholars, especially the earlier scholars. Uh, there are many people who confuse fiqh with Sharia. Uh, the fact of the matter is that fiqh is only an understanding of the Sharia, which was made by scholars, outstanding scholars. It's a process which would continue. But there were some outstanding jurists of the earlier generations who became very popular, and their religious understanding and their opinions on Sharia uh, became so very well known and popular that there emerged different schools of thought based on the understanding of these scholars. Uh, amongst the Sunni Muslims, when you divide the Muslim population into Sunni and Shias, probably 80% are Sunnis and 20% are Shias, but the claims could be different, if you talk to different people, the Sunni Muslims have four schools of thought which are normally followed: Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, and Hanbali. The fact of the matter is, as I said, these are all scholarly views and conclusions regarding what is Sharia. And as I said earlier, because we cannot make a claim that any one particular point of view, any one opinion is the correct one, because we are humans and therefore we have our limitations, and the arguments can lead one person to one conclusion and another to another. Uh, People started following one school of thought or one jurist, uh, in preference over others, and thus we normally find that Muslims have different schools of thought. The fact of the matter is that uh, Muslims are expected to follow the Quran and the Sunnah, and the ahadith are to be understood in the light of the Quran and Sunnah. And if there are disagreements, well, they are a part of the test, the trial that we are all going through. We are expected to use our intellect as much as is possible and uh, come to an honest understanding about what we think is the expectation of the Almighty on a particular matter. And I think the important thing regarding disagreements is that we must continue reviewing our understanding. And as and when we find that what we had learned and understood and followed earlier was not quite as correct an understanding as the one that we have come across now, it's making more sense. Uh, this possibility of changing opinions, revisiting our understanding, is what seems to be an important part of the trial, the test that we human beings are going through. Because to stick to a particular point of view, and to become rigid about it, is in itself a human failing. So what we need to do is to talk to each other, to learn from each other, to look at the arguments and so on. And the Islamic law, therefore, is both very firm in what it is, and yet it's possible to be understood uh, variously by different people, and therefore this process continues to date. And we still talk about it, we disagree, we try to understand the other point of view, and we put across our respective arguments. I think that's enough. I've talked a lot about different aspects of the law, and I want a discussion to now start.
I think you did. I think you did a great job. You
That
did
was
a
wonderful.
beautiful job. Beautiful job.
Thank you.
Really, really, really very good. Very good.
Do you have any questions, Rabbi Wiseman, for Dr.
Do I have questions? I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions. So first of all, I just want to give some appreciation. I heard recently somebody say about Imam Shafi that somebody asked him how he developed such good character, and he said, by listening to the people who don't agree with me. And, and I think that's I think you're right. I think it's very important to say that kind of inflexibility and so on is a human failing, right? And especially when we're finite beings trying to understand the will of the infinite for us, we have to be humble. We have to be very humble and realize that we're engaged in something which is really beyond us, and yet we're called to do it. So, it's not easy in that respect. One of the things that also struck me, I also heard recently, I'll share this with you because somebody was talking about the madhabs and the different schools. And And somebody said, he said, well, yeah, I follow Imam Malik strictly. And so the guy turned to him and said, so you're not a Maliki? And he said, what? He says, well, you're not a Maliki because the Malikis don't strictly follow Imam Malik, right? Because it's developed over time and so on. And so those are not, so sometimes the Maliki opinion is not according to Imam Malik. And I think that shows that how law develops and able to to be able to respond to real situations. We have to be able to live with it. On the hadith, one thing that strikes me, and I'll be very honest with you, and always strikes me as strange, is that there are certain, the Quran, for example, the Quran spends an amazing amount of time talking about justice. I don't know how many verses there must be in the Quran about justice and about justice and about oppression, but I imagine there must be thousands. I mean, there are lots and lots and lots and lots, and about food, table manners, and uh, and 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 details of prayer, almost nothing, right? And yet, when you look at the collection of the hadiths, I don't think Bukhari, for example, I don't think it has even a section on justice. I find it hard to imagine that being such a huge topic in the Quran, that the Prophet didn't talk about that. I'm sure he talked about that. So I sometimes wonder whether the interests of the editors, the interests of what was preserved. I remember a few years ago, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf published a very small book. It was actually a translation of a collection of hadiths from an African scholar that were all ethical. They were all sort of like how to be a good person hadiths, and they were amazing. I mean, each one was a jewel. Like, they were amazing. And he writes in the introduction, he says, almost all of these are weak, right? Almost all of these are weak. And I think that's a very interesting observation, even though there's some of the most useful, important lessons, nevertheless, they seem to have a weak thing, but they passed the hikmah test. They passed the chokhmah test. There's a certain so what do you think of that kind of disconnect between the subject matter of the Quran and the subject matter of the Hadith?
Yeah, I think it's a very important observation that you've made. And I do agree with you that there are some very important matters that have been talked about in the Quran clearly and frequently, which have not been quite the same way highlighted in Hadith. It's not that they are not mentioned in Hadith. It's not possible, for instance, as you mentioned, that the Prophet would have missed talking about adl, about justice. He talked about it, he practiced it, but somehow it did not strike the compilers of Hadith to have chapters fully, completely devoted to this particular subject. That's why we keep trying to clarify that while the Quran and Sunnah are divine and are the basic sources of understanding of Islam, Hadith has a human element. They were collected by humans, and there were 3 or 4 generations that were there intervening between the Prophet and the compilers. And therefore, what ultimately found, the information that found its place in books of Hadith is not exactly what was actually said. And the other difficulty in Hadith is that quite apart from the fact that you're not very sure what exactly were the words used by the Prophet, you're never sure about the context. Because I mean,
Right.
there is something that was said by him, but there was something more that was said, and that part was not mentioned by the narrator. And there are many examples of it,
Right.
uh, uh, which really makes you feel uh, inclined to believe that when you are uh, reading hadith, you've got to be very careful and should not just pass on the information, mentioning that this is what the Prophet said. And this is, one of the difficulties that we have while talking about Islam. Uh, there are many people who are found talking about Islam and quoting hadith more than the Quran. And uh, what they're quoting is only a part of the statement. And the other thing that I always continue to remind people is that because it's a human effort to collect information about the Prophet, it's incomplete. I mean, there is a big part of what he said and what he did that has not actually been mentioned because it was not humanly possible. And the last thing I would say is that, interestingly and understandably, uh, the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, his 23 years as a prophet, uh, that duration is divided into two parts: the Meccan period, the first 13 years, and then the Medinan period, which is the last 10 years. Interestingly and understandably, the Medinan part, which is a bit shorter than the Meccan part, is described in hadith in detail. And the Meccan part, which is a little longer and most certainly equally important, if not more, we have got very few ahadiths describing that period. And the reason is understandable. You see, the fact that the Prophet was such an important person, it became more and more confirmed only gradually towards the later part of his life. So in Mecca, they were struggling. I mean, there were only a few people. So all this actually is to emphasize the fact that this entire information about the life of the Prophet and what he said and what he did is because it's done by humans. Therefore, it's incomplete, it's imperfect, but most certainly it is important. It cannot be ignored, but it cannot be taken completely as it has been presented.
So now you led into my second question. So my second question is, and this is a concept I've never understood, and maybe you can explain it to me. So, as you said, there are two periods, right? There's two periods: the Meccan period and the Medinan period. And there are some people who have a kind of a doctrine of abrogation. The idea that verses which are revealed later, right? Verses which are revealed later are somehow more authoritative, and now, and it's interesting. In some way, it makes sense to me, honestly. But then the other way, I'll be very honest with you, it would make sense to me, because then why are they there, right? If you're not supposed to learn from them, then why would they be there? That seems like it. So what's your, how do you understand that?
Yes, I mean it's a very important question, honestly, and I do agree with you that there's a lot of debate and disagreement, and in my opinion, uh, many incorrect views and attitudes have emerged as a consequence of the incorrect understanding regarding the question of abrogation. Not, you know, for one thing, there is uh, apparently some abrogation in the Quran. And the idea is simple, that because the Islamic law evolved, uh, in some cases at least. And obviously, again, the question is why would God evolve a law? Uh, did he not decide clearly to begin with that what it should be? Well, the answer is that it was done so as to accommodate humans to be able to adapt to the Almighty's expectations gradually. Uh, Probably a very good example would be the example of prohibition of alcohol. Now, some people of Meccan society, they were so deeply into drinking alcohol that it was not reasonable to expect from them to do away with it immediately. Uh, we understand that as a part of His wisdom, the Almighty required them to gradually uh, eliminate this habit of drinking with the passage of time. So therefore, we have three different verses or types of verses that are there in the Quran. To begin with, one of them is condemning drinking, but not prohibiting it, mentioning that it's not a good idea. And the next one is telling believers not to say their prayers while they're drunk, while they're intoxicated. And then there is a final mention that all intoxicating drinks, they are completely prohibited. And there are other examples as well. So, looking at this question of abrogation from that point of view is quite understandable. Another famous example is, but I'm not going to go into the details of it, but quite often talked about the question of the mention of slaves and slave girls. On the one hand, it really seems from the mention of the Quran that it's a part of the normal routine of the life of a Muslim, that he'll have slaves and slave girls. But on the other hand, you also find that the Almighty is encouraging believers to emancipate and free them. And then you also see clear measures that are enabling slaves and slave girls to be freed. And it's a part of the system and a part of the law. And the understanding that you get is that it's all evolving and it's being done gradually, because it was not possible or not advisable to do it in one go. But the other aspect of what you've pointed out is probably more important to me. Uh, when the Prophet was in Medina and towards the final phase of his mission, he actually became virtually the ruler of that city-state. And he therefore was followed uh, by the believers and all those who were living there. There was a covenant understanding with other non-Muslims. There were Jews over there, etc. There were polytheists of Mecca over there as well. And as you rightly pointed out, there are Muslims who say that this Medinan part is what is important for us. And the Meccan part, which just talks about the fact that you should believe, you should be a good human, you should be patient, you should be thankful to the Almighty, you should worship the Almighty, and so many other things. And let's face it, 2/3 of the Quran is Meccan. That's kind of abrogated, if not completely, at least it's less in significance than the Medinan part. My understanding is that the entire Quran is important. The Meccan period is as important as the Medinan period. We living in different eras and different parts of the world have some element of the Meccan period, and probably some people have Medinan period as their experience of what the society is vis-a-vis their relationship with the message of the Almighty. So nothing is more important than the other unless there is a clear understanding that certain aspects of the text were kind of overtaken by some other mentions later. And this was because of the understandable evolution that took place in the implementation of law. And the last thing I would say is that those steps that were taken to begin with, which were ultimately replaced by others, are also important. Because, I mean, to give you an example, I keep telling myself and others that if I was to try to influence somebody who wants to come close to religion, but is into drinking, is alcoholic, I would not ask him to give up drinking immediately, completely. In fact, going by the example of what is mentioned in the Quran, I will tell him to phase, to go through different phases and to eliminate this bad habit of drinking gradually. So you're right, this whole understanding about abrogation that we find among some Muslims, to me, is not the right approach.
That's a great example. So if I remember correctly, right? If I remember correctly, the first verse says to weigh the benefits against the loss, right? It says that there's benefits to wine, right? And weigh the benefit. Now, to me, if I were talking, if I'm talking to somebody who trying to talk them into changing their ways, that's a great argument, right? That's a great argument. Say, okay, so look, okay, you want to do this, but let's take a look. Let's take a look at effects. Yes, maybe it relaxes you, but it could also make you angry, right? It disturbs your family. It disturbs. So I think that's a useful. It teaches you a useful tactic, right? A useful tactic in helping somebody deal with a habit, as opposed to just a prohibition. I think probably the most interesting discussion I've ever had on this topic was the verse about compulsion in religion, where I was talking about, I said there's no compulsion in religion. It says that verse is abrogated. So it says, and so my question was, okay, if it's abrogated, then why is it still there? I mean, and you're still reading it, right? You're still reciting it, you're still reading it, you're still studying it. So when you study it, are you studying it and saying, okay, no, thank you, and then continuing on, or does it continue to mean something?
I think this particular aspect that you've brought forth is very important, because abrogation has got to do with some practice, something that is to be done away with, something that needs to be implemented. Abrogation has got nothing to do with principles.
Right.
God's principles never change. I mean, if he says that there's no compulsion in the matter of religion, that is exactly what it means. I mean, how could it be that he would say later, oh no, wait a minute, there is compulsion in the matter?
Right.
So that cannot change. I agree with you.
I agree with you too.
Yeah. So I have, we could just keep going on. Lale, do you have questions, thoughts?
Yes, I that was really, really, really great. Thank you so much, Dr. Zaheer, and your amazing questions, Rabbi Wiseman, and your lovely answers.